The sun hung high over the sleepy town of Willow Creek, casting warm light across the cobblestone streets and modest houses. It was a community that seemed at peace on the surface, a picturesque blend of small-town charm and tight-knit neighborhoods. But beneath the surface, old tensions simmered, carefully hidden behind polite smiles and guarded conversations. The town was divided along invisible lines, shaped by generations of prejudice and misunderstanding. Though no one openly admitted it, Clara Johnson, 8 months pregnant and glowing with anticipation, bustled through the local grocery store. She was a familiar face in the community, known for her warm smile and kind demeanor. Clara had grown up in Willow Creek, left for college, and returned a few years ago after marrying her high school sweetheart, Andrew. Tragically, Andrew had passed in a car accident 6 months before, leaving Clara to navigate pregnancy and impending motherhood alone. Despite her grief, Clara remained resilient, focusing on the future and the life she was bringing into the world. As Clara pushed her cart through the aisles, she exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Cartwright, the elderly store clerk, who admired her strength. "You're going to be a wonderful mother, Clara," she said, patting her hand affectionately. Clara thanked her with a smile, though the weight of her responsibilities often felt crushing. With her family estranged and Andrew gone, Clara was determined to be everything her child would need. After paying for her groceries, Clara loaded the bags into her modest sedan, her movements slowed by the growing strain on her body. She was meticulous about her errands, knowing she needed to conserve energy for her shifts at the diner, where she worked as a waitress. That evening, she had just enough time to drop off the groceries and rest before her next shift. Life was a careful balance for Clara, an unending juggle of survival and hope. As Clara drove through town, she passed by the police station, an imposing brick building that loomed over Main Street like a silent watchdog. Officer Thomas Harris, a 20-year veteran of the force, was just stepping out of the station. Harris was known for his no-nonsense attitude and brusque demeanor. He prided himself on keeping order in Willow Creek, though his methods were often questioned. Behind his badge, Harris harbored biases he would never admit to openly. He viewed the world through a lens of suspicion, particularly toward those he didn't understand. Harris watched Clara's car pass and noticed her taillight flickering faintly. To him, it was reason enough to pull her over. He climbed into his patrol car and followed her onto a quiet residential street, his siren wailing as the red and blue lights illuminated the dusky sky. Clara's heart sank. She pulled over immediately, her pulse quickening as she saw the officer approach her window. "License and registration," Harris barked, his tone devoid of courtesy. Clara complied without hesitation, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the documents. She explained softly, "I didn't realize my taillight was out. I'll get it fixed right away." Harris peered into the car, his eyes narrowing. Something about Clara seemed to irritate him. Her calmness, perhaps, or the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Where are you coming from?" he demanded. "The grocery store," Clara replied, gesturing to the bags in the back seat. "I was just heading home." Harris wasn't satisfied. He began probing further, asking questions that grew increasingly invasive. Clara answered them patiently, though she felt her unease growing. She couldn't understand why a simple traffic stop was escalating into an interrogation. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite her nerves. "You tell me," Harris said, stepping back and motioning for her to get out of the car. Clara hesitated. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his tone sharp. Reluctantly, Clara obeyed, her pregnant belly making her movements slow and deliberate. As she stepped onto the pavement, a few neighbors peeked out of their windows, drawn by the commotion. Harris gestured toward the trunk. "Open it," he ordered. "Why?" Clara asked, her voice laced with confusion. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Are you resisting?" Harris snapped, his hand moving to his holstered weapon. Clara froze, fear gripping her. She raised her hand slightly, her voice shaking. "No, sir." I'm not resisting. Clara's face hardened. For the first time, she met his gaze directly. You don't know anything about me, she said quietly. Harris leaned in, his face inches from hers. I know enough, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. At that moment, Clara said something that made Harris pause. Her voice was calm but firm as she uttered a single sentence. You have no idea whose child I'm carrying. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Harris hesitated, the first flicker of doubt crossing his face. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his authority, grabbing Clara's arm to force her back into the car. Clara stumbled, clutching her belly protectively as she tried to steady herself. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and the man recording shouted, Hey, stop. She's pregnant. The sirens of another patrol car approached, and a second officer stepped out, assessing the scene with wide eyes. Harris, what's going on here? He asked, his tone urgent. She was resisting, Harris said defensively, though his words lacked conviction. The second officer glanced at Clara, her trembling figure and scattered groceries painting a very different picture. Clara stood tall despite her fear, her voice unwavering as she said, I wasn't resisting. He's lying. The second officer called for medical assistance, and the crowd began to close in, their phones capturing every angle of the unfolding drama. Clara's face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. She knew this was only the beginning of a battle she hadn't chosen, but one she would face for her child's sake. As Clara was escorted to an ambulance for a precautionary checkup, Harris stood frozen, the weight of what had just transpired beginning to sink in. The video of the incident was already spreading across social media, and by morning, the entire town would know what had happened. Clara's whispered words echoed in his mind, haunting him. You have no idea whose child I'm carrying. The night settled heavily over Willow Creek, but the town was anything but calm. News of the altercation between Officer Harris and Clara spread like wildfire, fueled by the shaky but damning footage captured by a bystander. By the time the video hit social media, it had already garnered thousands of views, comments, and shares. Words like brutality, racism, and pregnant dominated the hashtags, pulling Willow Creek into the glaring spotlight of public scrutiny. Clara sat quietly in her hospital room, the faint hum of monitors her only companion. Her baby was safe, the doctor reassured her, but the stress of the encounter had left her shaken. Her hands rested protectively on her swollen belly as she replayed the events in her mind. She had done nothing wrong. She was sure of that. Yet, she had felt utterly powerless under Harris's gaze, his authority wielded like a weapon against her dignity. Meanwhile, Officer Harris was at the police station, pacing the length of the small, fluorescent-lit conference room. His supervisor, Captain Darnell, stood across from him, arms crossed and face tight with frustration. What the hell were you thinking, Harris? Darnell demanded. Do you realize what you've done? That woman is pregnant, for God's sake. Harris's jaw tightened. She was acting suspicious, he retorted. I was just doing my job. Your job. Darnell shot back, his voice rising. Your job isn't to humiliate innocent people or escalate situations without cause. Do you have any idea how this is going to blow back on us? The video's gone viral. It's a PR nightmare. Harris shrugged defensively. I don't control what people post online. No, Darnell said coldly, but you controlled how you handled that stop. And now, we're all going to pay for your choices. As Harris sat down, grumbling under his breath, the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had always prided himself on maintaining control, but this time, the power he wielded had slipped, and the consequences were spiraling out of control. The seed of doubt planted by Clara's cryptic words began to grow. Who was she, really? And why did she say what she did? The next morning, Clara woke to find her hospital room buzzing with activity. Reporters hovered outside the building, clamoring for interviews, while inside, her phone vibrated incessantly with messages of support from strangers who had seen the video. Clara's closest friend, Naomi, arrived with coffee and a determined look. "Girl, you're all over the internet," Naomi said, setting the cup down on the bedside table. "People are furious about what happened. You've got everyone's attention now." Clara nodded, though the weight of that attention made her uneasy. She had never sought the spotlight. All she wanted was to live her life quietly and prepare for her baby's arrival. But now, she realized, she didn't have that choice. The injustice she had faced couldn't be ignored, not for her own sake, and certainly not for her child's. Across town, the growing outrage had reached the mayor's office. Mayor Collins, a seasoned politician with a reputation for neutrality, called an emergency meeting with the police department and community leaders. The conference room was tense, filled with the murmurs of concerned citizens and the sharp glares of activists demanding accountability. "This incident has put our entire town under a microscope," Collins began, her tone firm. "We need transparency and immediate action." One of the activists, a young man named Jamal who had grown up in Willow Creek, stood up. "Transparency isn't enough," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to happen. We need more than an apology. We need change." The mayor nodded. "And we'll get there. But first, we need to address the immediate situation. Officer Harris has been placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full investigation." The room erupted in murmurs, some voices expressing relief, others frustration that it wasn't enough. But for Clara, who watched the meeting unfold on the hospital's television, it was a small step in the right direction. She wasn't naive enough to think it was over. In fact, she knew it was just beginning. Later that afternoon, Clara received an unexpected visitor. A tall, older man with salt and pepper hair and a well-tailored suit walked into her room, carrying an air of authority. He introduced himself as Richard Coleman, a civil rights lawyer who had taken an interest in her case. "Clara, I saw the video," he said, sitting down in the chair beside her bed. "What happened to you was unacceptable, and I want to help." Clara studied him carefully, sensing something familiar about him. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you want to help me?" Coleman hesitated, then leaned forward. "Because this isn't just about you. It's about what you represent. The countless people who have been mistreated and silenced. And because I owe it to someone I lost a long time ago." Clara didn't press further, but she accepted his offer. She knew she couldn't fight this battle alone, and Coleman's experience and determination made her feel a glimmer of hope. As the days passed, the town's tensions reached a boiling point. Protests erupted outside the police station, with crowds demanding justice for Clara and reforms in the department. Signs reading "Justice for Clara" and "End Police Brutality" waved in the air as chants echoed through the streets. The community, long divided, began to unite in a shared purpose. Strangers who had never spoken before stood side by side, their voices rising together against injustice. Inside his modest home, Harris watched the news coverage with a sinking feeling. His wife, Linda, stood behind him, her arms crossed. "Tom, what were you thinking?" she asked, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "This isn't the man I married." Harris didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know what he had been thinking. All he knew was that his life was unraveling. And Clara's words still haunted him. "You have no idea whose child I'm carrying." Determined to make sense of it, Harris began digging into Clara's background. What he discovered left him stunned. Clara's father, whom she rarely spoke of, was none other than Benjamin Foster, a prominent civil rights leader who had once been at the forefront of the fight for equality. Foster had retired years ago and retreated from the public eye, but his legacy remained strong. Harris realized with growing dread that Clara wasn't just any woman. She was the daughter of a man who had fought against everything Harris had come to embody in his years on the force, and now his actions had drawn that legacy back into the spotlight, threatening to expose not just his own biases, but the cracks in the entire system he had served. As the protests grew louder and the investigation into Harris's actions intensified, Clara prepared for the fight ahead. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her child, for her community, and for a future where no one else would have to endure what she had. And in the back of her mind, she knew the storm was far from over. The truth about her family was out, and it was only a matter of time before the world learned what Harris had truly done. The air in Willow Creek was thick with tension, a volatile mixture of outrage and anticipation that seemed to electrify the town. Protesters lined the streets outside the police station, chanting slogans that echoed like thunder. The viral video had drawn attention from national news outlets, turning Willow Creek into an unwilling epicenter for a much larger conversation about systemic injustice. Clara sat in her modest living room, scrolling through her phone as messages of support poured in from strangers across the country. Some were heartfelt, offering encouragement and solidarity. Others were angry, demanding that she speak out and take a stand. Clara's head swirled with the weight of it all. She hadn't asked for any of this, but the choice to remain silent wasn't hers anymore. On the other side of town, Officer Harris sat in the kitchen of his suburban home, staring at the cold coffee in his cup. His wife, Linda, leaned against the counter, watching him with a mix of anger and disappointment. "It's not going away, Tom," she said, breaking the heavy silence. "You've stirred something up that's bigger than just you and her." Harris didn't respond. He knew she was right. His attempts to dig into Clara's past had revealed more than he had bargained for. The name Benjamin Foster had sent a chill down his spine when he first read it. Clara's father wasn't just some unknown man. He was a giant in the civil rights movement, a figure who had fought battles that Harris could barely comprehend. And now, by his actions, Harris had brought that legacy crashing into his life. Clara, meanwhile, found herself faced with an unexpected visitor. Richard Coleman, the civil rights lawyer who had reached out to her at the hospital, arrived at her home with a stack of documents and a quiet determination. He had spent the past few days preparing to take Clara's case, combing through the video footage and piecing together the larger narrative. "Clara," Coleman began, sitting across from her at the worn wooden table in her kitchen, "this isn't just about what happened to you. It's about what it represents. People are angry, and they're looking to you for leadership." Clara sighed, rubbing her hands together. "I'm not a leader," she said softly. "I'm just trying to take care of my baby." Coleman leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I know you didn't ask for this, but sometimes we don't get to choose when we're called to act. What happened to you was wrong. You have the power to change things, not just for yourself, but for others who've been treated the same way." Clara looked down at her hands, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She thought about her baby, about the world she wanted her child to grow up in. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "What do we do?" Coleman smiled, relief flickering across his face. "We fight." The first step was a press conference. Coleman arranged for Clara to speak publicly, flanked by community leaders and activists who had rallied to her side. The event was held in front of the church where Clara's mother used to take her as a child, a symbolic choice that tied Clara's story to the town's history of resilience and faith. When the day arrived, Clara stood nervously behind the podium, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. The crowd before her was larger than she had expected, a sea of faces filled with hope, anger, and determination. Cameras flashed, reporters jotted down notes, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Taking a deep breath, Clara began to speak. "I never thought I'd be standing here," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves knotting her stomach. "I'm not a politician or an activist. I'm just a mother trying to protect her child." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. It's not just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that allows people to be treated as less than human because of the color of their skin." Her words were met with applause and shouts of agreement. As she continued, Clara found her voice growing stronger, fueled by the energy of the crowd. She spoke about her experiences, her fears, and her hopes for a better future. By the time she finished, the crowd was roaring with support, chanting her name and demanding change. The press conference was a turning point. It galvanized the community, drawing more attention to the case and putting pressure on the police department to act. Mayor Collins, who had been cautiously neutral until now, called for an independent investigation into the incident, a move that further inflamed tensions within the department. Taking a deep breath, Clara began to speak. "I never thought I'd be standing here," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves knotting her stomach. "I'm not a politician or an activist. I'm just a mother trying to protect her child." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. It's not just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that allows people to be treated as less than human because of the color of their skin." Her words were met with applause and shouts of agreement. As she continued, Clara found her voice growing stronger, fueled by the energy of the crowd. She spoke about her experiences, her fears, and her hopes for a better future. By the time she finished, the crowd was roaring with support, chanting her name and demanding change. The press conference was a turning point. It galvanized the community, drawing more attention to the case and putting pressure on the police department to act. Mayor Collins, who had been cautiously neutral until now, called for an independent investigation into the incident, a move that further inflamed tensions within the department. Officer Harris, who had been watching the press conference from his living room, felt a knot of dread tightening in his chest. He had underestimated Clara, dismissed her as just a nobody. Now she was the face of a movement, and his name was forever tied to hers in the worst possible way. Determined to salvage his reputation, Harris agreed to meet with his lawyer, a slick-talking man named Victor Pierce, who specialized in defending law enforcement officers. Pierce advised Harris to stick to a narrative that framed the incident as a misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in judgment. But Harris knew that wasn't going to be enough. The truth was catching up to him, and it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. As the protests continued and the investigation progressed, more revelations came to light. Harris's personnel file, leaked to the media by an anonymous source, revealed a history of complaints against him, most of which had been quietly dismissed or buried. The file painted a damning picture of a man who had abused his power for years without facing consequences. For Clara, the revelations were both vindicating and heartbreaking. She thought of the countless people who had suffered under Harris's authority, their voices ignored or silenced. Her resolve deepened. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. The breaking point came when Coleman discovered a connection that shocked even Clara. Harris's father had been a deputy sheriff during the civil rights era, known for his involvement in suppressing protests and intimidating activists. The discovery added a chilling layer to the story, tying Harris's actions to a legacy of prejudice and oppression that spanned generations. When Clara learned of the connection, she felt a pang of sadness. Harris wasn't just a bad cop. He was a product of his upbringing, shaped by a culture of hate and fear. It didn't excuse his actions, but it gave her a glimpse into the complexity of the man who had caused her so much pain. As the community prepared for the upcoming trial, the lines were drawn more clearly than ever. Clara was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of resilience, a voice for those who had been silenced. Harris, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated, his former allies distancing themselves as the weight of the evidence mounted. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only determine the outcome of Clara's. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with townsfolk, reporters, and activists who had traveled far and wide to witness what had become the most significant trial in Willow Creek's history. Outside the courthouse, the streets buzzed with activity. Protesters held signs that read "Justice for Clara" and "End Police Brutality," while counter-protesters, albeit fewer in number, waved banners proclaiming "Support the Blue." The tension was palpable, as if the entire town was collectively holding its breath, waiting for the scales of justice to tip one way or the other. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded over her swollen belly. She looked calm on the surface, but inside, her heart was racing. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The moment when the world would hear her story in full. To her left, Richard Coleman prepared his opening statement, his movements precise and deliberate. He had spent weeks crafting his arguments, poring over evidence, and strategizing how to dismantle Officer Harris's defense piece by piece. At the defense table, Harris sat rigid, his face a mask of defiance. His lawyer, Victor Pierce, whispered in his ear, occasionally gesturing toward documents spread across the table. Harris's gaze flickered to Clara, and for a brief moment, a shadow of unease crossed his face. He quickly looked away. The judge, an elderly woman with a reputation for fairness, entered the courtroom and called the proceedings to order. The hum of murmured conversations ceased as everyone turned their attention to the bench. Coleman rose first, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than a traffic stop gone wrong. It's about the abuse of power, the perpetuation of prejudice, and the violation of basic human dignity. Clara Johnson, an 8-month pregnant woman, was targeted, humiliated, and physically endangered by the very person sworn to protect her. The evidence will show that Officer Thomas Harris acted not out of duty, but out of bias and a reckless disregard for Clara's rights and safety." Coleman's words hung in the air, heavy with gravity. He then played the video of the incident, the courtroom silent except for the sound of Harris's voice barking orders and the crowd's distant shouts of protest. When the clip ended, several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The defense countered with their own narrative. Pierce argued that Harris had acted within the bounds of his duty, claiming Clara's behavior during the stop had been suspicious enough to warrant his actions. He painted Harris as a dedicated officer who had simply made an error in judgment during a high-stress situation. But the cracks in his argument began to show almost immediately. Coleman called witnesses to the stand, starting with the bystander who had filmed the encounter. The man recounted what he had seen, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "She wasn't doing anything wrong," he said. "She was calm, respectful, and cooperative. Harris was the one escalating things." Next came the doctor who had treated Clara at the hospital. He described the physical and emotional toll the incident had taken on her, emphasizing the risk it had posed to her unborn child. Each testimony added another layer to the prosecution's case, painting a vivid picture of the harm Harris had caused. Then came the most damning evidence of all, Harris's personnel file. Coleman introduced it with the precision of a surgeon, highlighting the numerous complaints that had been lodged against Harris over the years. He pointed out patterns of behavior, instances where Harris had targeted minorities disproportionately, used excessive force, or displayed unprofessional conduct. Each revelation chipped away at Harris's credibility, leaving the defense scrambling to contain the damage. But the moment that truly turned the tide came when Harris himself took the stand. Pierce had advised against it, warning that his client's temper and lack of remorse could backfire. But Harris, stubborn as ever, insisted on telling his side of the story. At first, Harris tried to appear composed, framing himself as a dedicated officer who had been unfairly vilified. But under Coleman's cross-examination, his facade began to crumble. Coleman's questions were sharp and relentless, forcing Harris to confront the inconsistencies in his account. When asked why he had searched Clara's car without probable cause, Harris stammered, unable to provide a satisfactory answer. "Officer Harris," Coleman said, his voice calm but cutting, "you've claimed that you acted out of concern for public safety. But isn't it true that your actions were driven by bias? That you saw a black woman, a pregnant black woman, and assumed the worst?" Harris's face reddened. "I know. That's not true," he stammered. Coleman didn't relent. "Then explain your words during the stop. You said, 'You people think you can get away with anything.' Who exactly are you people, Officer Harris?" The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Harris as he struggled to respond. His lawyer attempted to object, but the judge overruled, allowing Coleman to continue. Finally, Harris broke. "Fine," he snapped, his voice rising. "I was frustrated, Okay, this job, it wears you down. You deal with the same people, the same problems, day after day. Sometimes you make assumptions. Sometimes you're wrong. The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as Harris had come to acknowledging his biases. For many in the room, it was confirmation of what they had suspected all along. The climax of the trial came when Coleman called Clara to the stand. She spoke with quiet strength, recounting the events of that day in vivid detail. Her voice cracked at times, but she never faltered, her words carrying the weight of her experience. When asked why she had chosen to pursue the case, Clara's response silenced the room. "I'm not doing this just for me," she said, her hand resting on her belly. "I'm doing it for my child. For every child who will grow up in a world where people are judged by the color of their skin. I want my baby to know that their mother stood up for what was right, even when it was hard." As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their closing arguments. Pierce urged the jury to consider Harris's years of service and the difficult nature of police work. Coleman, however, delivered a powerful rebuttal, reminding the jury that authority without accountability was a dangerous thing. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of their decision evident in their drawn expressions when they finally returned to the courtroom. The foreperson stood, her voice steady as she read the verdict. On the charge of violating Clara Johnson's civil rights, we find the defendant, Officer Thomas Harris, guilty. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she grasped Coleman's hand, overwhelmed by relief and vindication. Harris, meanwhile, sat motionless, his face pale and his hands trembling. The judge delivered the sentence a week later. Harris was stripped of his badge and sentenced to community service in underserved neighborhoods, along with mandatory training on racial bias. For Clara, the victory was bittersweet. The scars of that day would remain, but so too would the knowledge that she had made a difference. As she left the courthouse, her head held high, Clara was met by a crowd of supporters who cheered her name. She smiled, her hand resting on her belly, as she walked into the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for her child and for the community that had stood by her side. The trial had ended, but the echoes of its impact reverberated through Willow Creek and far beyond. Clara Johnson had become a household name, not just in her small town but across the nation. News outlets featured her face alongside headlines about justice, resilience, and reform. Social media was flooded with images of Clara holding her belly as she left the courthouse, her expression one of quiet strength. The moment symbolized triumph over adversity, a beacon of hope for many. But the aftermath of the trial was far from simple. For Clara, life was a whirlwind of emotions. There was relief, of course, a sense that justice had been served. But there was also exhaustion, grief, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The world was watching her now, and while she hadn't chosen this path, she felt compelled to walk it. The first days after the trial were a blur of interviews, phone calls, and messages. Activists reached out, urging Clara to speak at rallies and events. Organizations offered her platforms to share her story. Some people even suggested she run for public office, a prospect that Clara could hardly fathom. All she wanted was to focus on her pregnancy and prepare for the arrival of her baby. Yet she knew that the fight wasn't over. Not for her and not for the countless others who had faced similar injustices. Meanwhile, Willow Creek itself was undergoing a transformation. The trial had brought to light issues that the town could no longer ignore. Mayor Collins, under pressure from activists and community leaders, announced a series of reforms aimed at addressing systemic bias in the police department. These included mandatory bias training, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and a commitment to hiring officers who better represented the town's diverse population. The changes were met with mixed reactions. Many residents welcomed the reforms, seeing them as long overdue. Others, however, resisted, claiming that the measures were unnecessary or overly punitive. Among the latter group were some of Harris's former colleagues, who viewed his conviction as a betrayal. The police department became a hotbed of tension, with officers divided over the future of law enforcement in Willow Creek. Harris himself had retreated into the shadows. Stripped of his badge and sentenced to community service, he avoided public appearances and spent his days fulfilling the terms of his sentence in the very neighborhoods he had once policed with suspicion. At first, he approached the work with bitterness, seeing it as nothing more than punishment. But over time, something began to shift. One day, while repainting a community center in a predominantly black neighborhood, Harris struck up a conversation with an elderly man named Mr. Jenkins. The man, who had lived in Willow Creek for decades, spoke candidly about his experiences with racism and the ways it had shaped his life. Harris listened, at first reluctantly, then with growing interest. He began to see the humanity in the people he had once viewed through a lens of prejudice. By the time Harris completed his sentence, he was a changed man. He didn't expect forgiveness, nor did he believe he deserved it, but he was determined to learn from his mistakes and to find ways to contribute to the community he had wronged. He enrolled in counseling sessions on racial bias and joined a local mentorship program, working with at-risk youth to help them navigate the challenges of growing up in a divided society. For Clara, the weeks following the trial were a delicate balancing act. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy, whom she named Andrew, after her late husband. Holding her son for the first time, Clara felt a surge of love and determination. She promised herself that she would do everything in her power to create a better world for him, one where he wouldn't have to fear for his safety because of the color of his skin. As she settled into motherhood, Clara also embraced her role as an advocate. She began working with local organizations to promote police reform and community building initiatives. She spoke at schools, churches, and town hall meetings, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak out against injustice. Her voice, once hesitant, grew stronger with each passing day. The town, too, began to heal, though the process was slow and uneven. The protests subsided, replaced by community forums and dialogues aimed at fostering understanding. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now sat side by side, sharing their experiences and finding common ground. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way. But for the first time in years, Willow Creek felt like a place where change was possible. One of the most profound moments came during a town-wide reconciliation event organized by a coalition of community leaders. Clara was invited to speak, and to everyone's surprise, so was Harris. It was his first public appearance since the trial, and the atmosphere was tense as he stepped onto the stage. He spoke haltingly at first, his voice heavy with emotion. "I can't undo what I did," Harris said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I can't take back the harm I caused. But I can learn, and I can promise to do better, not just for myself, but for this community." Clara watched him from the side of the stage, her expression unreadable. When it was her turn to speak, she addressed the crowd with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the trial. "We can't move forward unless we're willing to face the truth," Clara said. "Not just about what happened to me, but about the systems that allow these things to happen. It's not enough to demand change. We have to be part of that change. All of us." Her words were met with a standing ovation, and for the first time, Clara felt a sense of closure. She had turned her pain into purpose, her struggle into strength, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. As the event came to a close, Clara and Harris crossed paths. They exchanged a brief nod, not forgiveness, not absolution, but an acknowledgement of the shared humanity that had been so easy to overlook. It was a small moment, but in its own way, it was monumental. In the months and years that followed, Willow Creek continued to evolve. The changes weren't perfect, and progress was often met with resistance. But the town had been irrevocably altered by Clara's courage and the community's collective demand for justice. Clara herself became a symbol of hope and resilience, her story inspiring others to stand up for what they believed in. And though she couldn't predict what the future would hold, Clara knew one thing for certain. She had fought for her son, for her community, and for herself. And in doing so, she had helped to build a foundation for a brighter, more just tomorrow. Years passed, but the memory of what had happened in Willow Creek remained etched in the hearts and minds of its residents. The trial of Officer Harris and the events that followed marked a turning point not just for the town, but for everyone involved. Life in Willow Creek had changed in many ways, yet some things, like the hard work of healing and reconciliation, remained constant. For Clara, the journey after the trial had been one of growth, transformation, and resilience. Her son, Andrew, was now a lively and curious 5-year-old, full of questions about the world. He was her greatest joy and her strongest motivator, a constant reminder of why she had chosen to fight in the first place. Clara had made a life for them in Willow Creek, choosing to stay in the town that had been the stage for her most challenging moments. She was determined to be part of the ongoing effort to create a better future, not just for Andrew, but for all the children growing up there. Clara's advocacy work had expanded over the years. What began as local activism had grown into a national platform. She became a sought-after speaker, traveling to cities across the country to share her story and push for systemic reforms in policing and community relations. Her message resonated deeply, inspiring grassroots movements and influencing policies at the state and national levels. Clara always emphasized one key point: change began not with grand gestures, but with individual actions and accountability. Despite her growing prominence, Clara remained grounded. She continued to be an active member of her community, volunteering at the local youth center and organizing town hall meetings where residents could come together to discuss issues and solutions. Her presence was a source of inspiration for many, a living testament to the power of courage and resilience. Willow Creek itself was a town transformed. The police department underwent significant restructuring under the watchful eyes of the Civilian Oversight Board. New policies were implemented to improve transparency and accountability, and officers were required to undergo regular bias training and community outreach programs. The reforms didn't eliminate all issues, but they were a step in the right direction, and for the first time in years, there was a sense of trust beginning to build between law enforcement and the community. One of the most notable changes was the annual Unity Festival, an event Clara had helped to organize. Held every summer, the festival brought together residents from all backgrounds to celebrate diversity, share stories, and build connections. It featured music, food, art, and open forums where people could discuss the progress and challenges in their community. The festival became a symbol of hope and renewal, a reminder of how far the town had come. Harris, too, had found his own path forward, though it was a far quieter one. After completing his sentence, he had taken a job as a groundskeeper at the local park, a role that allowed him to work in solitude. The years had softened him, and he had come to see his actions for what they were: manifestations of a lifetime of biases and unchecked power. He didn't seek redemption through public gestures or declarations. Instead, he focused on listening, learning, and making small but meaningful contributions to the community he had once wronged. One day, as Clara and Andrew walked through the park, they saw Harris tending to a flower bed near the playground. Clara hesitated for a moment, her instinct urging her to turn away. But Andrew, ever curious, ran ahead and began asking Harris questions about the flowers he was planting. Harris looked up, startled at first, but then smiled gently as he answered the boy's questions. Clara watched from a distance, a mix of emotions washing over her. She didn't interrupt, letting the moment unfold naturally. That evening, Andrew asked about the man he had met in the park. "He seemed nice," Andrew said, "but he looked sad." Clara paused, considering how to respond. "He's someone who's made mistakes," she said finally, "but he's trying to make things better now." Andrew nodded thoughtfully, his young mind processing her words. Clara marveled at how simple and profound children's perspectives could be. In that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. not just for Harris, but for the possibility of growth and understanding in everyone. As time went on, Clara's influence continued to grow. She published a memoir detailing her experiences, titled More Than Just a Nobody. The book became a bestseller, sparking conversations across the country about race, power, and justice. Clara's story resonated with people from all walks of life, many of whom reached out to share their own experiences and thank her for her courage. But for all her accomplishments, Clara remained humble. She often said that her greatest success wasn't the book deals or the speaking engagements, but the quiet moments at home with Ander, watching him grow into a kind and compassionate young boy. She knew her fight hadn't been just for herself. It had been for him, and for the future he would inherit. The legacy of Clara's battle rippled far beyond Willow Creek. Other towns began implementing similar reforms, and a new generation of activists drew inspiration from her story. Clara's name became synonymous with resilience and the power of ordinary people to drive extraordinary change. Yet, she always reminded those who looked up to her that she hadn't acted alone. It had been the collective will of her community, the solidarity of those who stood by her, that had made change possible. One evening, as Clara sat on her porch watching the sunset, Ander curled up beside her with his favorite book. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, "do you think the world is a better place now?" Clara looked at him, her heart swelling with love and pride. "It's getting better," she said, "but it's up to us to keep making it better." Ander nodded, his eyes bright with understanding. "I want to help," he said, "like you do." Clara smiled, wrapping her arm around him. "You will," she said. "I know you will." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a warm golden glow, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led her here, to a place where hope was not just a fleeting feeling but a tangible reality. And though the work was far from over, she knew she wasn't alone in it. Together, she and her community had proven that even in the face of darkness, light could prevail.